going to start off with talking about some background information on the anterior insula. It activates, or it's been implied in the past that it activates when experiencing, expressing, and recognizing disgust. It's located near the amygdala. This is the anterior insula. That's the posterior insula. Actual physical stimulation of the anterior insula evokes a visceral response, so it causes you to be sick or vomit. And actually, a study in 2008 explained that just imagining an experience of being disgusted or in a situation where you're disgusted actually activated the anterior insula and the adjacent frontal operculum. Some more background on the disorders that we're explaining in this: behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, BVFTD. This is a form of frontotemporal degeneration. Some of the symptoms: more impulsive, decrease in empathy, even for loved ones that they loved before, increase in apathy. They don't really care about, they have a lack of concern for how their behavior affects people around them. But the good news is that the majority of cases are not linked to a genetic mutation. More background on the semantic variant primary progressive aphasia, SVPPA. This is atrophy of the frontal and temporal areas of the brain, and because of this degeneration, people show difficulty in recognizing familiar objects, faces, and words. So people are fluent in their speech, but a lot of times they're unable to understand and generate keywords like nouns. So the rationale behind the study that we read is kind of what I explained earlier. The insula was implicated in disgust processes, but it wasn't known for sure whether or not the insula is required for experiencing, expressing, and recognizing disgust. So to address this, the current study hypothesized that the insula lesions are associated with deficient experience of disgust, as evidenced by the presence of disgusting behavior. So if you have a lesion in your insula, or insular lesions, then you're going to behave in more disgusting manners. The tendency, and then the second hypothesis is the tendency to engage in disgusting behaviors and the inability to recognize disgust, and that would correspond to distinct but overlapping patterns of anterior insula atrophy. So again, decrease in the amount of brain tissue or the gray matter that's in the insula, anterior insula, increases the amount of disgusting behaviors and decreases the ability to recognize disgust. So to test this, they analyzed charts of 305 consecutive patients. They had two comparison groups, 25 patients who were asymptomatic first-degree relatives of patients with BVFTD, and we're going to call them the FM group, and the control group of 90 healthy older adults, and we're going to call them the HS group. They also conducted neuropsychological testing on 287 of the 305 patients, and all of the FM patients and all of the HS patients to measure dementia severity. And to do this, they looked at the clinical dementia rating scale and the mini mental state examination. So they had two raters review the patient reports, caregiver reports, and clinician observations for evidence of disgusting behaviors. And to measure emotion recognition, they used the emotion evaluation subtest of the awareness of social inference test, which they watched 14 20 to 30 second videos of actors portraying one of the 6 emotions, including no emotion. And a lot of you had questions on the Boxa-based morphometry, or morphometry, whatever it's called. And my kind of understanding of it was that it measures regional brain volume by voxel-wise comparison, and a voxel is like a 3-dimensional version of a pixel, I guess. So you can measure the activation of that part of the brain and the volume, so like how much of that part of the brain is being activated more than just on a 2-dimensional scale. And it's also used usually to test between subjects. You can compare subjects. So the results, the first analysis they looked at was how gray matter and the presence of disgusting behavior was related. And to do this, they looked at the region of interest analyses of insula. The insula found disgusting behaviors associated with reduced ventral anterior insula volumes at a significance level of less than 0.05. The second analysis, they wanted to look at how gray matter affected disgust recognition, and they found that there was a positive correlation between peak voxels bilaterally in the ventral medial insula, amygdala, and the temporal pole, and the disgust recognition scores. So the more voxels that you had or displayed in your brain for the ventral medial insula, amygdala, and temporal pole increased as your scores on the disgust recognition scores increased. The third analysis wanted to look at gray matter and impaired disgust recognition, but not the other emotions. So it's essentially the same as analysis 2, except they controlled for all of the other emotions on the. So it controlled for happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and no emotion, and only looked at how disgust affected them. And there's more results. This is the imaging from. Well, the first one, A, is the engagement in disgusting behaviors and where the activation was. And the second one, B, is disgust recognition, how their brain reacted to recognizing disgust. And then C is the overlap in, right, it's both A and B, and the overlap is shown in the yellow here. And the regions in A, that's indicated by the arrows, showed that the region of interest analysis of the insula restricted patients with both of those diseases we talked about earlier, BVFTD and SBPPA. The regions in B, indicated by the arrows, remain significant after controlling for recognition scores of the other emotions. So essentially, A is a display of analysis 2, and B is a display of analysis 3. So in the discussion, we kind of get to what we were talking about, or what the whole point of this. So the decrease in bilateral insula gray matter volume was linked with an increased tendency of disgusting behaviors and impaired disgust expression recognition. So kind of again, when restricting the analysis to just the individuals with those diseases, the presence of disgusting behaviors was associated with a decrease in gray matter in dorsal anterior insula regions. And again, it's because those two diseases decrease the amount of, they have atrophy to those parts of the brain, so they cause that increase in, or decrease in disgust recognition and increase in disgust behaviors. And recognizing disgust behaviors is predicted again by a decrease in gray matter in ventral anterior and central insula regions involved in olfaction and gustation. So the conclusions that we can make from this is that the anterior insula is involved in both subjective feeling and the recognition of disgust. And before we couldn't really say that because it was more an implied thing, but now with this research we're able to say that it is involved. But that's just it. It is just involved. It's not the only part of the brain that recognizes disgust and things like that. So there are other parts that are involved in the process. And because BVFTD and SBPPA cause damage to the anterior insula, that leads to an increase in acts of disgusting behaviors. And these are just some interesting things that I noticed in the discussion or the conclusion, that the insula is just this little, it's this little tiny part of the brain, right here. But like just each part of that insula is related to these different incoming stimuli that's presented to you. So if you have a social economic or social emotional task, then it activates the anterior ventral insula and so on. I just thought it was kind of interesting that this small part of the brain has such specific areas to what kind of stimuli is presented to you.